Hi everyone, it's Melissa with Southern Kentucky Therapy, and I am coming to you today to talk about some really good news, and that is the good news and the concept of neuroplasticity in our brains. So, what that means is previously it was thought and believed that your brain, the function of your brain, only developed in early childhood, and then once your brain reached full maturity around the age of 23 or so, it was kind of a downhill slope from that point. And after it reached full maturity, then you couldn't continue to develop new brain cells or create new gray matter and strengthen areas of the brain or regain function after it was lost because of disease or dementia or brain injury and trauma. But what we now know is that our brains are these amazing things that have neuroplasticity. And so what that means is we can strengthen parts of our brains that have become weak or have become deconditioned through intentional activities and stimulus and experiences and reading and growth. And we have a lot of opportunity. We can train our brains to begin to heal from past traumas, and we can train our brains and condition our brains to have a more positive and helpful thought process versus a negative and unhelpful thought process. So there's a lot of things that we can do. And so the reason that I tell you this is to help you to feel empowered that if you are struggling with mental health issues, or if you've been the victim of very traumatic situations in your past, it doesn't always have to be this way. If you're struggling with intrusive thoughts or whatever the case might be. So with neuroplasticity, the brain can change and it can adapt and it can strengthen, it can reorganize itself, and it can take certain functions and it can move those functions. If one part of the brain is damaged or not working properly, then it can kind of move some of those functions so that other parts of the brain pick up some of the weight. So the brain is just amazing. It can do so many cool things, and this brings hope for everyone. Now, there's always kind of been this concept that everything was just black and white. If there was some type of intellectual disability, that you could only go so far with that disability. Or if there had been a brain trauma, you may be able to regain some, but you will never be able to go past a certain limit. If there's been stroke activity, that you would never be able to regain some of those things that the brain previously did. But working in the medical field and working with medical professionals as part of an interdisciplinary team, I have seen otherwise. My own father actually had a brain injury, and he went from very soon after that brain injury to having a certain type of ability with his brain and what he could do. And then after many, many years, he was able to regain a lot of his memory. He was able to regain a lot of his social abilities. And so there was a transformation even in his personality. So there's a lot of things about the brain that we just don't understand. The brain is an amazing, very complex thing, and we don't understand a lot of it. But it's just important to know that it can change, it can adapt, it can reorganize itself. And there are things that we can do. So it's not just a hopeless situation. So experiences, if you give yourself an opportunity to have new experiences, then you are going to strengthen your brain through learning new skills, learning new concepts, researching, reading, environmental stimulus, music, listening to classical music, listening to all different kinds of music. It can stimulate different parts of the brain and begin to help us to learn and grow. And again, we talked a little bit about injury and disease in the brain and what that can look like. So our brain is not just a static organ that is just whatever it is. We always had these ideas that there was like a normal brain and then an abnormal brain. And if you've ever read very much into the research, you've all seen the brain and different parts of the brain are lit up, or you've seen a brain and there wasn't as much gray matter in one image of the brain versus the other image of the brain. And so we kind of just draw this conclusion that if the brain looks one way, there is a normal brain out there, and our brain is not a normal brain. Some of us don't even want to have like a scan of our brain because we're so concerned about what could be found. But it's interesting and it's important to note that there is no such thing as a normal brain. Our brains are constantly changing due to this neuroplasticity. And so even as you're watching this video, and even as I'm talking to this video, my brain is adapting and it's changing and it's growing and it's flexing, and this is strengthening areas and There's just a lot going on up there. So it's just, there's things would be lighting up if we had a scan. So it's really cool to think about. The brain can change its physical structure. It can generate new neurons, and it can change and grow. Now we know in early childhood and up to a certain point, the brain does a lot of this. There's a lot of growth and activity in the brain. And before, it was believed that once you reached a certain point, there wasn't anymore. Now we know that that's not true. And even in working with dementia patients, there is growth and development that can occur. They can relearn skills, they can strengthen, they can gain abilities to a certain point. Now, of course, we have to look at that and what a person can tolerate and what a person's capable of. A lot of things affect this. So we've talked about physical structure of the brain, but then also the functional structure of the brain. So when certain parts of the brain slow down or are not functioning properly, other parts of the brain can begin to pick up some of that weight. Some of those tasks can be redirected. And so an example of this would be a person who is losing their vision and losing their eyesight. The part of the brain that is responsible for eyesight might not be doing as much, but other senses will kind of step in and be stronger and pick up. So hearing will be stronger, and other sensations, the sense of smell, and just that intuition will begin to grow and be more. And this is very general, so there's a lot that we could get into as far as how the brain works and what the brain does. But just to kind of drive home that point that the brain is constantly growing, it's constantly changing and flexing. So how can we strengthen our brains? Like, give me some practical ways that this matters to me. Experience and learning. Physical exercise is important because physical exercise strengthens our brain's ability, our sharpness, our perception, everything. We need physical exercise. Adequate sleep at night. If you're not getting adequate sleep, then your brain is not going to function optimally. Diet and nutrition are very important for brain function, getting the nutrients and the vitamins that we need, getting enough water. All of that affects how well our brain functions. So if you want to be sharp-minded and you want to be intelligent, then you need to be considerate of your diet and your nutrition. If you're feeding yourself a lot of junk, then your brain is going to be kind of bogged down. If you're giving yourself fruits and vegetables and nutrition, then your brain is going to be like, okay, we're ready, let's go. Stress is a big one. So if you're under long-term chronic stress, then that is going to slow down the function of the brain and the ability of the brain to heal itself. So decreasing your stress. You also have to consider your age. So as you get older, it is going to be harder for you to learn new skills. You're going to come up across some barriers. But what I challenge you all to do is not to let that stop you, but to continue consistently and persistently to work towards your goals. Reading is a good one. So if it's been a while since you've read anything, you might notice if you start to read that it's hard for you to comprehend what you're reading. But if you consistently read every day and you continue to push through that barrier of decreased comprehension, then you will begin to realize, like, oh, I just read 3 chapters in that book and I retained the information and I comprehended and I can summarize that, and things are different for me now and this is better. We're strengthening those muscles, we're fine-tuning that ability, and we're getting back into the practice of doing that. Another thing to think about is your environment. So if you're in a very stimulating environment, then your brain is going to fire more and it's going to be stronger. So thinking about bright colors, thinking about music, thinking about textures, thinking about all of these things, rather than like beige and plain and not a lot going on, not a lot of conversation, not a lot of thought-provoking, not a lot of writing or journaling or meditating or, any of those kind of things. So you all might think that is super boring, but for me it's very exciting to think about the brain and the plasticity of it. And there are ways that we can snap ourselves out of these loops of ruminating and out of these loops of this unhelpful brain processes. Once we realize that there are certain things that we're struggling with, there are ways that we can strengthen that, and we can help ourselves. We have the ability to improve what we're eating, to make sure that we're getting enough sleep at night, to read, and there are tools and resources that we can use to make tomorrow better than today was. And we can model that for our children, and they can model that for our children's children. And so that's the good news for today, that our brains are very flexible and very amazing and strong and capable. And if we give ourselves the tools and resources that we need, we intentionally put ourselves into situations where we're stretched a little bit and we have to learn and we have to grow and we have an opportunity to experience things we've never experienced, then our brains are going to respond to that. So that's the good news for today. If you guys have any questions or concerns, you can shoot me an email, southernkentuckytherapy@gmail.com, and I hope you all have a wonderful week.